Winter Latina Show.
Hosted by IDM.
Yeah, finally. Hello, everybody. Hello, Nina. How are you doing?
I'm doing better than last week. I'm no longer coughing up my lungs. I decided to spare you last week. I am severely sleep deprived, which means I'm very caffeinated. So this probably will make for a fun episode. You know, on the show, we talk about fun topics like death, destruction, economic collapse, war, interspersed with a little bit of humor. So I think this my high caffeination state would be very appropriate for today. And I'm really excited about today's guest. I've been following his work on X/Twitter for a while. He has very sort of broad picture political commentary interspersed with financial and economic analysis. His name is Alex Krainer. He was born in Croatia back when it was Yugoslavia. He is the founder of Krainer Analytics and the creator and publisher of iSystem Trend Compass reports. He is formally educated in business and economics in Switzerland, so hopefully we'll get really solid analysis in the fields that Marcelo and I both lack. He has worked as a market analyst, a researcher, a trader, a hedge fund manager since the mid-1990s, and he's published a number of books, which you can find on Amazon, and when we bring him on, he'll probably tell you about where else you can find them, and we also linked all the appropriate websites in the description so you can check them out yourselves. So Marcelo, let's bring Alex on.
Yeah, without further ado, just remember everybody to like, share, subscribe, send this on WhatsApp to your auntie that tells you, good morning things and you never answer. If you're that auntie, send the link to your nephew.
Send her some rose emojis
answers
in this video. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we have a super chat. Thank you, Wendelson. And without further ado, Mr. Alex Krainer. Hello,
welcome.
Mr. Kramer. How are you doing? Welcome.
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to join you, and warm greetings to all your viewers and listeners.
Thank you for coming on. I really would like you to correct me on anything that I may have mispronounced or butchered, and maybe add a little bit more to your biography so we can understand your expertise a little bit better.
Well, I would only make one correction at this point, that is that anybody could find any of my books on Amazon, because Amazon canceled me completely. They deleted all my books. I published 3 books, and they deleted all of it. And I have my one geopolitical book called Grand Deception is available from Red Pill Press. It's a book about the historical relations between Russia and the West. And my 2 other titles are basically about commodities trading, and they're available for free from my website, iSystem Trend Following. And the reason why they're free is not because they're crap, but because Amazon, one of them got even an award as the best book about commodities trading for investors and traders in 2021 and 2022. But what Amazon did after they canceled me is they continued to sell my books. And this one that won an award, they were selling it at something close to $1,000. Of course, none of which was going to me. So I thought, okay, well, what I'm going to do is put them on my website for free, so people can pick them up if they don't mind reading in PDF. They're still there for free. You go to my website and you find the About tab, and in the About tab, you'll find both the titles. And so that's that. That's the only correction.
Thank you for the correction. So to clarify, the obvious question arises, why were you canceled? Was it the political book that you published? Because your description is still on Amazon, so it's pretty interesting the way that works.
The political book was banned 6 weeks after it came out. Okay, and it was banned by the orders of one of those swamp creatures from the State Department. His name was Jonathan Weiner. He wrote a letter to Amazon, and Amazon axed my books, no questions asked, and that was that. And then Red Pill Press approached me, and they said, like, hey, maybe we can republish your book. And then they spent the next 9 months combing through the prose to make sure that there was nothing there that they could be sued for. And then they republished it, and we changed the title because the original title was The Killing of William Browder. And we changed that to Grand Deception. And then they republished it under their own label. Everything fine, but only 5 weeks. And so after 5 weeks, it got banned again. The other two books, which were completely non-controversial, because it's been commodities trading, risk management, these kind of things. I got axed because what happened is that Amazon wasn't paying me out any royalties. And then when my first book, called Mastering Uncertainty in Commodities Trading, when it got an award, then the sales went from like 2 books a month to like 10, 15 books a day. And so then I started noticing that they're showing me I'm earning all these royalties, and then they're showing like they paid me out, but they never received any money. So I was like, oh. So I asked where did my money go, and it took a bunch of time for them to get back to me. And they said, oh, right, yeah, we actually owe you some money. And then literally 3 hours after that email, I got another email from Amazon saying like, oh, guess what? We're not going to pay you out anything, and we're going to delete your account. So that's what they did. And I think that the second thing, which happened in 2023, or 2022, this happened because I think they must have algorithms, like they figure out whether it's more interesting for them to
Can you hear me?
or to simply steal their royalties. And I think that in my case, it was stealing the royalties, which was more profitable. And, Jeff Bezos has a space program, and he was building a large yacht, and all this cost a lot of money. So we have to understand that.
We have to feel sorry for the oligarchs.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Poor them.
Yes. We have to help if we can.
We all have to chip in a little bit.
Jumping quickly here, we have another channel called Through the Eyes Off, with Anya K, if I'm not mistaken. She is also, or was also, an Amazon publisher, and when she started doing the updates, she's Polish. And when she went to Moscow, because she started this channel, having interviews with Larry Johnson, with Andrei Martyanov, all the 5-star guys. And she went to Moscow, and she just logged in Amazon there, and whooped, they canceled her account.
She logged into Amazon from Moscow.
Yeah, I mean, it was naiveness from her part. There's a series. It's not exactly a documentary series. It's kind of based on real facts in Netflix, which is the German guys that actually wrote Google Earth, and then Google just simply stole from them. And it was just easy to do that because people have no chance to go to the United States and sue the companies like Google, like Amazon. Well, and even if they do, they're going to lose anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Marcel, we should clarify allegedly, because we are using a Google platform. So allegedly. that is the claim that's been made. But
yes. But there's also been a lot of lawsuits by alleged people who got allegedly made love to by Amazon involuntarily, and so allegedly, this is quite a widespread practice.
Allegedly. in our
So I
personal
know that
opinion.
I know that I'm not the only one.
Well, in the end, it's always good to support independent publishers because the money goes direct or buy directly
Yes.
from the author, of course, as opposed to funding Amazon. But obviously, this seems political. So, in your case, was it specifically the title referring to Bill Browder? Like, what was
No.
the no? Okay, it was the content.
No, I think it was the content because there's a whole lot of things in there that I think that the swamp, the ruling establishment, would prefer that the American people didn't know about, and generally people in the West, because there's a lot of history that's been scrubbed away from Western curriculums. And I didn't know them myself. You know, when I started the research on this book, I was blown away. You know, we went down the rabbit hole, and it's just one thing after another. And I thought, my God, somebody needs to, you know, put this out. And I thought, okay, well, it may as well be me. So that's, you know, I kind of took up the project, and I finished it in 2017, and I published it. And you know, it wasn't one of those things that they like for people to know. For example, that you know, Russia and the United States were very, very close allies throughout the 19th century and into the, you know, first and second decade of the 20th century. That Russia intervened in U.S. Civil War on the side of the Union and helped Abraham Lincoln preserve the Union, because had Russians not intervened, the United States probably wouldn't exist today.
There was also backing during the revolutionary period. I'm not sure if you covered that as well, but
yes. No, I didn't. That wasn't in my book, but I am aware of the history. Yeah, so you know, that relationship between Russia and the United States goes back a long time. It has mostly been friendly and mutually supportive, i.e., they were close allies and friends. And let's say the 19th century was considered part of the American folklore, that this was like such a tight alliance and such a close friendship that it was basically part of the American national identity, this friendship with Russia. And then, you know, it took a lot for them to scrub that away and turn that into the hostility that we have today, which has, you know, which doesn't come. It doesn't happen randomly. It's created deliberately. I'll give you an example, like a concrete data point. I was watching a presentation by Vladimir Posner to Yale University in 2018, and during the Q&A session after the presentation, Vladimir Posner told his audience that he had paid himself a group of researchers to dig up all the stories from the New York Times for during a period of 3 years, 2016, 2017, 2018, all the stories that mention Russia in it. And to find all the stories that mention Russia in any positive context. And guess how many they found? There's no, zero, exactly. So, you know, like either there are zero redeeming qualities to Russia and Russian people, or there's a fatwa out there that thou shalt not speak well of Russia. And, you know, I've been to Russia on several occasions. I know some Russian people, and I can tell you there's a lot of redeeming qualities to Russia. And so is the latter. It's the fatwa, thou shalt not speak well of Russia. And that's become part of our cultural folklore today in the West. And so you still have a lot of these people who think of themselves as educated, you know, because they read newspapers, who know what a terrible, horrible place Russia is and what an evil thug Vladimir Putin is. And so, I thought these kinds of things, and particularly the protagonist of my book, William Browder, they were actually deliberately dragging the West into a large-scale conflict, world war against Russia. And I thought this needs to be stopped. This we can't have this. And so anyway, that's how I decided to write my book, and it didn't get very far, but in a way, the fact of Amazon banning it actually gave me some attention. So I didn't sell many copies of the book, but it went around. It went around as a free PDF quite a bit. So it didn't die. It didn't die, and it didn't get silenced.
So kind of like the Streisand effect, don't read that book, and then everyone jumps and goes to see the book.
Yes, a little bit, yeah.
I think we should clarify that Vladimir Posner, if our listeners are not aware, is a kind of an older Russian journalist, but he's very liberal. So it's interesting that he would be pursuing kind of this trajectory of trying to mend the relations between Russia and the US, at least at that stage, because politically he's much more liberal in terms of like pro-West liberal in terms of instead of being kind of more patriotic, nationalistic, perhaps. And
well,
we should also
during the 1990s, he was quite a big name in the United States. He used to have programs with Donahue, and so back then he was almost a household name.
Yes,
so
exactly.
Not a nobody.
Yeah, and I think we should also clarify for those who don't know who Bill Browder was very active in Russia in the 1990s. We talked about the dismal, hellish privatization policies on this program earlier, so I think our listeners would be aware of the type of things that happened with just insane privatization of public funds, the way that a small number of Russian oligarchs got rich, the way the sort of regular people suffered. So that's the context in terms of the kind of person that this individual is. Shockingly, he follows me on X. I'm not sure why. I don't know how I earned that.
Me on X.
I never interacted with him, so I was kind of shocked to find out that this person that I don't really think highly of, for whatever reason, follows me. I guess maybe he considers me to be one of those evil Russians who is disseminating, alternative narratives. But let's get back to sort of the original idea for this presentation. You may have noticed that we called it "All Roads Lead to London." This is something that you say a lot on your X account, because I think a lot of times when people think about who rules the world, they talk about the US as the sole hegemon. So it's very interesting that you would be talking about London as a financial center. And your recent YouTube video that I think everyone should go and check out sort of connected all these seemingly disconnected ideas between the economic situation in Britain, the recent race riots that took place in Britain, the level of backing that Britain has provided for the war in Ukraine, and you sort of really nicely pull all of that together. So if you can kind of elaborate on why do you use this tagline, "All roads lead to London"? What is the idea behind it? What are the sort of the financially/economic and political reasons for this?
Okay, so I began to understand this exactly while I was doing the research for my book Grand Deception, because if you look at things kind of on the surface level, you get the impression that we're living in the age of the American empire. The United States is the most powerful nation in the world. They're just running the show, and then there are all these little satellites that kind of tag along, and Britain is one of them, maybe the most faithful partner of the United States in all of this. But then when you dig a little bit under the surface and you start trying to understand the moving parts in this whole equation, you realize that actually an awful lot of initiatives are coming from London. And an awful lot of these conspiracies seem to originate out of London. And so I realized that Bill Browder, so he used to run the largest foreign-owned hedge fund in Moscow during the 1990s, in Russia during the 1990s. And he ended up taking UK citizenship. So he became His Majesty's subject. I think that happened in 1996 or 1998. And his main business partner, literally partner in crime, is the HSBC Bank, which kind of swallowed up Edmond Safra's First Republic National Bank of New York. And, Bill Browder's second home, so he lived part of his life in Russia, in Moscow, but he was flying to London every other weekend for family reasons. But then when he got kicked out of Russia in 2005, he moved back to London, not to the United States. And so all of his activism, his shady backers, they're all in London. It all ties back to the British establishment. And after he got kicked out of Russia, there was I think, that St. Petersburg Economic Summit in 2006 or 2007. Actually, it was going to be Tony Blair himself, who was still prime minister at the time, who was going to intervene in Russia on his behalf, so that he could get his visa to return to Russia. So it's very, very strange for a hedge fund manager to be able to get that kind of support from the prime minister of the country where he lives but doesn't really operate. And then, this is like, oh, well, he ran this big hedge fund and it was, very important. No, it wasn't that big, It was, I think at peak, it was $3.5 billion, which in hedge fund industry terms, is not big at all. It's actually kind of mid-size. So, the whole importance, the connections, it's all very, very murky, but it all leads to London. So that's when I started to kind of pay very close attention. And then, once you know what you're paying attention to, then you start seeing it absolutely everywhere. And so, so Bill Browder affair is not household item to most people, but Russiagate is closer to home. And if you remember Russiagate, practically the whole thing was cooked up in London. So the man who drafted the dossier, Christopher Steele, former MI6, I don't know how former he is, but they work for MI6 and they set up their own consultancy, and then they're former MI6, but they still work for the same network. His boss was Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6. Then there was Stefan Halper, another MI6 asset. There was, I don't know, half a dozen names, all of them linked to the British foreign policy establishment and or MI6. And even there was a person who was living in Virginia, close to the CIA headquarters, whose name escapes me now. He also was a former MI6 person, former British guy. And then the funny thing is that, all of this wasn't covered very extensively in the media in the United States, with the exception of Fox News. And Fox News, the man who was all over this was, what's his face? Sean Hannity. Sean Hannity was all over it. And I don't know if you'll remember, but all of his reports about Russiagate, he was very pro-Trump. So he was defending Trump about Russiagate. But he was also clearly, very deliberately obscuring the role of all these Brits in the, how do you call it, in the affair. And so he would, almost every night, he would say several times, Russian lies, Russian propaganda, and then he would refer to the dossier as a dossier put together by foreign nationals. And he would he would do this in a way to give you the impression that, yeah, the Russians, right? It's the Russians. Well, the Russians had nothing to do with it whatsoever. There was one Russian guy, I forget his name, but he was living in London. He was working for Christopher Steele, and he was like supposedly the original source of the allegations, but he was some, nobody who just, you got some Russian nobody to give you this to say that it comes from a Russian source. Okay, that's how glib it was. Anyway, so Sean Hannity would always say Russian lies, Russian propaganda, and the dossier put together by foreign nationals. Well, those foreign nationals were all Brits. And it's practically unmentionable. In another affair, which is more recent, well, it's not that recent, it's 12 years ago, but it's the HSBC affair. When HSBC in the United States got caught laundering money for a terrorist organization and the Mexican drug cartel. And then, there was this massive SEC investigation, and they got documentary proof that HSBC was doing that. The consequences under U.S. law should have been that the HSBC should have lost banking license for the United States, and about 30 individuals from the board of directors and the C-suite management should have ended up in prison with stiff prison terms. Instead, they got a parking ticket of about 5% of their revenues for 2012, and everything got kind of shut down, all on the orders of London. It was letters going from George Osborne in the British cabinet to Obama administration to Eric Holder, and Eric Holder intervened on HSBC's behalf. They muzzled the Department of Justice and the SEC, and you never heard of the thing ever again. And HSBC continued to live happily and make profits in the United States ever after, and launder money for drug cartels and financing terrorism. So that's a British bank. That bank is the main partner in crime of William Browder.
So is this alleged or is this proven in terms of the sort of the crimes?
The HSBC affair is no. The HSBC affair is very much proven, and
it's proven. Okay.
It's such a big story. There's a 300-page Department of Justice or SEC or U.S. Senate Banking Committee. I forget who, but there's a 300-page investigative report which can be found, but you don't want to read a 300-page investigative report. So what you can do is you can find John Titus' documentary film, All the Plenary's Men. Okay, that's the title, All the Plenary's Men. And that documentary is 1 hour, but in that 1 hour, he lays it out with such nice condensed clarity, which makes it obvious that Eric Holder and Barack Obama's administration were traitors to the United States, that HSBC was guilty of laundering money for Mexican drug cartels and terrorist organizations, and that they got off scot-free, essentially.
Interesting. I think for those of us who may not think of London as this hub beyond being a major financial center, even for those of us who pay attention to sort of the mainstream news, we remember the crazy story of the Skripal poisonings with Novichok, and these people disappeared after all this publicity, and no one knows whatever happened to them, whether they're alive or dead. I mean, there was clearly a very particular purpose for using them in this way. We also know, you talked about all these oligarchs moving from Russia to London. We know that someone like Boris Berezovsky was in London. He was exiled, but he was sort of trying to come back. He was writing these apology letters directly to Putin, and it looked like things might work out. And then he died for those of us who like to put on our tinfoil hats in a very strange way. We don't really want to go too far into this particular story, but you guys are welcome to Google it. The timing and the way he dies is just very weird. So, of course, conspiracy theories, you can say they're going too far, or you could say there's definitely something to digging a little bit deeper into the way he died. Something strange happened there. So we definitely see that. But I think in today's day and age and the current context of the war in Ukraine, again, if we only pay attention to the mainstream media headlines without putting on our, tinfoil hats, we see the extent to which Britain is involved in sort of fanning that war, sometimes even more than other countries. We've talked about the way Boris Johnson supposedly intervened in 2022 during those peace talks that were very detrimental to Russia, but nonetheless, they were peace talks. We've seen more recently, I think, Alex, you talked about the Kursk or the Kursk offensive, as North Americans would say, and the role that Britain is alleged to have played specifically in that regard. So I think even looking at these headlines, we can kind of see that there is a lot of seemingly initiative taking coming from Britain as opposed to, let's say, the global hegemon, which then kind of makes you think about some other things as well. What do you think about that?
I think the more you look into it, the more difficult it is to avoid the conclusion that London is the global headquarters of the Western Empire. It's the empire's philosophical, strategic, spiritual headquarters. It's the mortar of the empire, and most of these war initiatives come from London. I'll give you another example. We talk about war in Ukraine, but there's another interesting example, which also kind of died in the media. There was a little contrail that appeared with it. So that was in, I think, 2019, when the Iranians downed American drone in the Persian Gulf, and there was a lot of pressure on Donald Trump to launch a bombing campaign against Iran, which would have triggered a large regional war almost inevitably. And so, for whatever reason, Trump told us his reason, but there was probably other reasons. Trump declined, and then there was a volley of cables exchanged between the British Embassy in Washington, D.C., and London Foreign Office, where the British ambassador in Washington, Sir Kim Darroch, was absolutely incensed that Donald Trump didn't go and bomb Iran. And those cables were revealed by Anonymous at the time, and they got picked up by the social media and many of these alternative media sites. And so he was lambasting Trump for not taking the opportunity to launch war against Iran. And but the communications also revealed that the pressure on Trump to do that was coming from the British Embassy. They were talking about Trump being reluctant, but that they can push him by flooding the zone around him, by making sure that all of Trump advisors are on the same page and that they all influence Trump the right way. And then when that didn't work, then Sir Kim Darroch was so incensed that he actually insulted Donald Trump. He wrote, I don't remember exactly the word, but he wrote some ugly things about Donald Trump in those cables. And when they got leaked out by Anonymous, it was scandal enough that the Brits had to recall him and send a different ambassador. It was so this all had Trump bombed Iran, we never would have known. This would be again the United States doing the bad things around the world, and the BRICS go along with it because of our allies that we have to support our ally and look at all these bad things we've done just because we were trustingly dragged to in these wars around the world. You know, it's like it's kind of a Prince Andrew excuse of why he was continuing to see Jeffrey Epstein, because he was too honorable, you know. So it's always the same thing. But it's once you start paying attention to this, it's everywhere all the time. And now Ukraine, you know, the Ukrainians launched this suicidal incursion into Kursk on the 6th of August. Zelensky was in London for 2 days on the 17th and 18th of July, discussing this with Keir Starmer's cabinet. We know that because Mikhailo Podolyak, Zelensky's security advisor, told us as much. And so we know that it was discussed in London. We know that the plans for this incursion were made at least a year in advance. They never pulled the trigger because it was an idiotic idea to begin. But why they pulled the trigger now in 6th of August, as they are already losing the war in Donbass, is quite a mystery. I've listened to many military analysts, and nobody can come up with a better idea than, they were going to take control of the Kursk nuclear power plant, and then use it as a bargaining chip in their negotiation. Okay, so that's plausible, but they could have done this only at a massive cost to themselves, and the likelihood of them succeeding. It's one thing to take control of it; it's something else to actually keep it. So it was going to be a suicidal mission anyhow. That doesn't make sense because you're weakening your defenses in the front where the war is being decided. To go and grab something is going to cost a huge bill to try to do that. So it doesn't make sense at all, except for the following: that Ukraine actually defaulted on the 1st of August. So they had all these bonds that they weren't servicing because they were granted a grace period for 2 years by the foreign bondholders, worth about $20 billion, right? That's bonds owned, so sold by Ukraine to private investors like BlackRock, Amundi, Fidelity, PIMCO, these kinds of large Western asset managers. And so they granted Ukraine 2-year grace period. Okay, you don't have to service these debts, but that grace period was expiring on the 1st of August. And then in the second half of July, there were these negotiations where Ukrainians, these Western bondholders were very, very keen for Ukraine to start servicing at least the interest on those bonds. And Ukrainians were, no, we can't. And everybody knew that the state of public finances in Ukraine was so catastrophic that it was going to capsize Ukraine. So the Ukrainians were asking for a 60% reduction in the amounts that they owe. The bondholders were offering 22%. Finally, in London, during that time when Zelensky was visiting with Starmer and everybody, okay, we'll do 37% reduction, but you need to start the process of restructuring these debts and start paying us the interest on them. And so Zelensky goes back to Ukraine, and so what was supposed to happen is they had this deal, but it wasn't binding on all the bondholders. It was just a preliminary deal agreed to with an ad hoc team of representatives of these bondholders, which pretty much means he probably sat down with Nat Rothschild or Alex Soros, whatever, and then they, in the press release they call it ad hoc committee of bond, whatever. So the Ukrainian finance ministry was supposed to go to these bondholders and basically beg them to accept new bonds in exchange for the old bonds with the 37% reduction. And they were offering them 1.5 cents to accept the deal. Okay. Then on the 24th July, Fitch downgrades Ukraine from CC to C. C is reserved for countries that are already in default. So this is basically they torpedoed the Ukraine. This is very mysterious to me. I would love to know who made that decision, because Fitch credit rating review of Ukraine wasn't due until December of this year. And normally you don't just pull out the file and say like, hey, why don't we just do this now? You have to have a really, really good reason to bring it forward 6 months. So somebody made that decision for some reason, and I need to find out who or why, because this basically, this is like Ukraine hitting an iceberg, and Ukraine's bondholders and the UK and the EU and everybody who's on the hook for this. You'll notice that, Bank of America is one of the largest bondholders there, because Bank of America ultimately is through Merrill Lynch, ultimately has the largest share in BlackRock. BlackRock has massive. They have large exposure to Ukraine bonds. BlackRock is getting rid of real estate in Florida as we speak. Warren Buffett is getting rid of Bank of America stock shares like as fast as he can. It's like people who know are boarding the lifeboats, and people who don't know are still partying in the in the second and third class of this Titanic. But it's sinking. It is sinking. And so on the 31st July, Zelensky signs a decree suspending all servicing of foreign debts. Basically, declare default in not as many words, and the decree takes effect the next day on the 1st of August, exactly the day when the grace period granted by the foreign bondholders expired. And then 5 days later, they go and launch this incursion to Kursk, right? Interesting. And what happens on the same day exactly is that the Council of Europe approves a 4.6 billion euros payment to Ukraine. Okay, and they cite because Ukraine was supposed to be doing all these reforms and blah blah blah, and they've done great. They've been reforming their public finances and management of state-owned companies and privatizations and this and that. Some straight A's all along the line. They never mentioned the downgrade, the credit ratings downgrade, and they never mentioned the unilaterally declared. But they sent them 1 week later. They sent them $4.6 billion, and I believe probably the $4.6 billion euros went straight to the bondholders to plug up the hole and to keep the system from imploding. And then at the very same time, the Bank of England is preparing us for the new repo programs, which is now growing by leaps and bounds. So on the 22nd July, the exact same day when the Ukrainians announced this deal with bondholders, the Bank of England announces the new thinking about the management of bank reserves so that they can better support businesses and the economy in the UK. And they say like, hey, we should be doing more repos. For anybody who remembers the repo crisis of 2019 in the United States, going the route of repos basically means that one or more of your banks in your system is bankrupt. Basically, they can't balance their books. They have too many bad debts on their books, and so the central bank has to bail them out. And then they do this through repos, which are repurchase agreements where you post collateral to the central bank, and then they give you cash, and you're okay. And then maybe the collateral can be toxic sludge, but they say, okay, well, for us this is worth 100 cents on the dollar, so here's the money, and you're in business. And so the Bank of England pretty much announced that they will be accepting a much broader range of assets as collateral in the repo programs. And I bet you that Ukraine bonds will also be accepted as good collateral in those repo operations, so that everybody, all the pension funds and hedge funds and big banks in Britain can be bailed out, and they'll be bailed out by the Bank of England basically printing money and giving it to all these institutions that should be going bankrupt.
This is making 2008 sound like kindergarten compared to what you're describing. I'm afraid to ask what impact this would actually have on American economics, European and British.
Well, so it's going to be different, I believe, this time around because of the repos. Because in 2008, they had to go to Congress and beg for the bailout money, because the central bank couldn't just legally create all that liquidity and supply it to the markets at their discretion. And then they changed the regulations and they changed the laws, and then there have been further changes in the regulations with the COVID pandemic. If people go to, I think it was 31 May 2020, Mario Draghi penned an op-ed in Financial Times, and this op-ed, I think everybody should have that on their hard drives. It pretty much reads like a banking coup. The bankers have taken over. And so what's going to happen is that the Bank of England is just going to go ahead with these repos. It's probably going to amount to open-ended quantitative easing, so printing of unlimited amounts of money with time. And so the effect of it will be that it will create high levels of inflation. And so they will rescue the banking system, but they will stick the whole rest of the economy with a price floor. Everybody else is going to have to pay tabs. So, the point being, we're probably not going to see a banking failure like Lehman Brothers, but we are going to get a process of inflation accelerating. And so instead, we're going to get a scenario like Argentina, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and these kinds of places where, people end up impoverished because of the open-ended money printing, collapse of the currency, the debasement of the currency, and who knows, maybe even hyperinflation. We'll find out. I don't think anybody can predict this even with any remotely accurate terms, but this is very, very symptomatic for all such systems, and practically every empire that ever was, if they used money and credit, this is how they ended, with a banking failure, crisis of hyperinflation, and economic depression in the end.
Can you make a prediction for Ukraine? I mean, in addition to just getting these massive amounts of so-called military funding, other foreign economies are essentially running Ukraine's even public offices. So, I mean, it goes much deeper than just giving them money for war. And you just said that they defaulted. Can you make a prediction maybe in sort of the medium to the long term of what would happen to that country? I know it's difficult, but...
It's difficult because Ukraine is facing a total social and economic collapse and political. And so there's going to be a political takeover by not necessarily Russia, but pro-Russian governments, which is not even difficult to predict, because when this whole mess started, apart from the junta in Kiev, and their, neo-Nazi supporters, which were a relatively small percentage of the population, Ukrainians largely were not hostile to Russia, and a majority of them were actually very friendly to Russia. And we have many, polls and surveys that were run all the way up to 2022, which prove that. And I think that once your nation is invaded, that all goes out the window. People revert to some kind, like they close ranks, they revert to tribalism, but eventually they'll sober up, and a different administration is going to take over, and they will have to talk to the Russians. They will be making deals with the Russians. And the Chinese are going to come in with large amounts of investment funds. And so Ukraine will prove a very important component of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And so Ukraine will play a very, very important part strategically and economically in that part of the world. But the recovery will take, I would say, 10 to 20 years. I think that Ukraine will be much, much better off in another 10, 20 years. And this is not a very bold prediction either, because Ukraine, of all the countries in the world, Ukraine had the worst economic performance since its independence, far and away. So between 1991 and 2014,
I wonder why.
Yeah, no, that's deliberate. That's very deliberate. Like if you wanna turn a nation into a Nazi military boot camp, you immiserate the people first. You create misery, and then you start providing money, but through military structures. You start attracting young men who have been deprived of a future, who have been deprived of jobs and any meaningful way to fulfill their aspirations. You give them a military career, and you attract them into these Azov and IDAR and C-14 structures, where they're trained to be tough. Where you brainwash them that they have these grand historical missions of bringing the nation to the greatness that was taken away from them by the Russian Jewish mafia, blah, 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 blah. All of that was done. And all of that was done on purpose. And all of that was done in a premeditated, planned way. Anyway, it's like all of this is going to get flushed. Well, we have precedents, because Germany went through the same process. Italy went through the same process. In a different way, Soviet Union went through the same process. And so we know that, there's a rough road ahead. But the Chinese are literally waiting for this war to end, to come in with investment funds, with investment projects. And Ukraine is a very, very rich country in terms of resources. Unfortunately, not so much in terms of well-educated population, because by now almost half of them have either dispersed or have been killed. But there's great potential there to develop, and it will be developed, and then it will be integrated as a part of this multipolar world, rather than part of the Western empire of lies.
I think this is a very cogent explanation, because you often hear, what is the Chinese role in the war in Ukraine? Why is China cooperating with Russia to the extent that it does? And I think this investment explanation, after everything is said is done, is very plausible. So that brings me to my next question. Where do you see BRICS? You really kind of have a spectrum of opinions. Some people think it's a paper tiger, it's completely irrelevant. That was sort of the dominant thinking maybe 10 years ago or so. Other people see it as a threat to unipolar hegemony. Perhaps truth is somewhere in the middle. Where do you see this organization? Where is it going? Is it really going to bring a more maybe multipolar, fairer world to us all? Or is that kind of a delusion?
No, I don't think it's a delusion. I think it's very, very real. I think it is an entirely new, okay, let's go back to George Soros, because one thing that he told us 3 years ago in Davos is that, what we are observing in the world today is a clash between two systems of governance. And that's very, very, a war between NATO and Russia, and Israel and Palestine, and China and the United States. There's all these conflicts, but they all have something in common, and they really are battles in this war between two systems of governance. And so George Soros explains this as open societies versus closed societies, which is just basically a how do you call it, a slogan, essentially. That doesn't mean anything. What it is actually is the clash between the Western oligarchic, imperialistic, colonialist system versus everybody else, the whole rest of the humanity, including all of us who live under this oligarchic colonialist empire. And so the clash is led by, United States as the military, economic, political muscle of this empire, but actually directed out of London on the one hand, and on the other hand is everybody else, but at least in terms of main political, diplomatic, economic, and military strength, is basically the axis Russia, China, Iran, and the SCO now. And Russia and China are, in all earnestness and all seriousness, developing a very different kind of system of governance, a very different arrangement about how nations can trade with one another, how nations can cooperate with one another. It's moving away from the state of permanent warfare to the state of perhaps simply constructive cooperation and mutual benefit for all.
I think it's really interesting. Sorry.
No,
okay, I
was,
hear you.
Both of you have your images frozen, so I thought that maybe I ended up talking to myself.
No, you're also frozen on my end. Then apologizing to our viewers for whatever Wi-Fi issues we're having. Perhaps the evil powers in London, the alleged evil powers in London, are interfering right now. But we're plugging away. So go ahead, Marcelo.
Fun. Image is actually about all right, better than usual, actually.
Oh, okay.
And sound for Alex is a little shady every now and then. Is dropping a little bit every now and then. We have even comments from Who Cares here saying that Amazon and
And
CIA and
Google and Bill
MI6,
Browder are
everybody
are
is
interfering.
is interfering with his sound. But I mean, most of the time, I see the latency is going up and down, but for Alex basically. But most of the time, the sound is about right and the image is tolerable. I apologize to everybody.
Stop it, Bill Browder. I'm just joking. Yeah, we apologize for any technical issues. But I think if you look at the way that Eurasian integration is heading, you kind of have to cooperate if you're going to build across the continent. And so far, we've seen, for instance, China coming into the traditional Soviet sphere of influence in Central Asia. You don't really see Russia sort of challenging that much. So there does seem to be an understanding with the relative weights of these economies, China being this developing giant. So that's really interesting. Obviously, China is also involved in places like Belarus. So Ukraine would be the next obvious step for them after the war is hopefully over. And Marcelo, I believe you had a question about Chinese-Indian relations, which, we never really talk about on this channel. So I'm not sure if Alex would be able to clarify that topic for us.
Well, yeah, I was watching an interview you did with Nima from Dialogue Works, and I've been participating to some X Twitter, or according to Larry Johnson, Shitter, locals, what's it called? The live streams there, and I've had a lot of people asking me, Brazil about all that, since I'm Brazilian. So I kind of try to tell as much as the recent history as I can. Although I'm living outside for almost 10 years now, so I kind of lost a little bit of the touch of Brazilian politics, and it's interesting for me that many people see BRICS as this giant new solution for multipolarity and all that. At the same time, I see a lot of people worried about India and putting a little bit of hopes in Brazil as the next how to call it, big industrial power instead of India. And I've seen that I know that Chinese and India has some issues, territorial issues, border and stuff like that. But when I look at it, it sounds to me much more like China and India. Yeah, they have those disputes, but their diplomacy has surpassed that. And what we see now is what you mentioned that had never passed through my mind. What you mentioned in Nima's channel, Dialogue Works, is that we have this recently Sri Lanka issue, Pakistan issue, now Bangladesh issue, all kind of surrounding India. And this is probably going to, shoot themselves in the foot again, and just going to push India toward China again, like happened with Russia and China getting together, and now India and China getting together, and everybody being happy, and the United States being away from that. So I would like to understand, how do you see the relation? Okay, I spoke too much, sorry. I would like to understand, how do you see the relations about China and India and the BRICS dynamics at this point? And if you can or know how to include Brazil on that, it would be quite important for me as well.
Well, I think it's very difficult to predict those things, because a lot of what the West, the people who run the show in the Western Empire, and then their agents that run the diplomacy and the secret diplomacy and intelligence services, they always have these clever plans, which they go and they launch around the world. but they haven't been working out lately. And let's go back to 1993, when Paul Wolfowitz formulated his famous Wolfowitz doctrine. And then, the project for the New American Century was then organized in 2000, I think. And so they were literally planning this worldwide, global, full spectrum dominance, where it was going to be the new American century, and the United States is going to be the only superpower and the global hegemon, and they were going to destroy and cut down to size any potentially emerging rival everywhere around the world. And so it was just going to be, the United States was going to be the sheriff for the whole planet. And 20, 30 years later, look where we are. They got their backhands handed to them in Afghanistan by the Taliban. They have all these, carrier strike groups and these big Navy vessels in the Red Sea. They cannot subdue the Houthis, who are, running circles around them. They were supposed to take over Syria. They failed. They were supposed to break up Russia with using Ukraine as a proxy. They failed. So it's one thing after another, and at every step, the empire is growing weaker and weaker and weaker. And I think that when they suffer the defeat in Ukraine, then even financially the bottom's going to fall out. And so the BRICS are now a real alternative, and more countries want to join. There's going to be a lot of attempts at sabotage, trying to, Argentina, for example, they brought Javier Milei, who, for I don't know what reason, there's like a segment of the population that adores Javier Milei like he's some freedom fighters. He's no such thing. He's completely a Manchurian candidate of the Western Empire, proven by sending Argentina's gold to London. For what reason? I don't know, but obviously because they need it in London a lot more than the Argentinian people need it.
Here we have London again.
Sorry?
Here we have London again.
Yeah. It goes to London, right? but it's the empire is growing weaker and weaker and weaker. Not only that, but the other side, the challengers, the BRICS, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Turks, they're trying to see through the game. So all these intrigues that are being played that might have worked once upon a time, in the decades ago and last 2 centuries, they're not any longer. And so the empire is really growing. It's collapsing in the accelerating trajectory. And things are not very complicated, actually. And I'll explain the crux of the matter, the difference between the empire and what anybody reasonable would do if they were arranging relationship between 2 nations or more nations. It's the empire basically wants control of the resources. That's the colonialist aspect of the empire. Why do they want the control of the resources? Because those resources are money good collateral for the financial system. And the financial system can turn those collateral into loans, which become then assets on their balance sheet. So, if the United States has military bases in, Saudi Arabia, then they can oblige the Saudi government to give preferential access to those resources to Western corporations like Exxon and BP and Shell and so on. And those companies, to develop those resources, are going to take out loans. They're going to finance those developments with Western banks, which means that Saudi oil reserves are going to become collateral of Western banks. And on the basis of that collateral, Western banks are going to be able to lend billions to these oil companies. It goes on from there because there's a multiplier, because when those assets start trading, they're going to make a lot of people wealthy, then they're going to be buying and selling stuff, starting their own businesses. It has a multiplier effect. So $1 billion worth of oil reserves can turn into $1 trillion worth of financial assets on these banks' balance sheets. Now, the reason this is important to the banks is obvious now, but it's not at all obvious why that anybody else cares, and nobody else cares actually, because when you go to the gas pump to buy oil, you have to pay for it anyway. It's not that if the United States controls the resources, the oil is free to the American people. It is not. But the alternative to this imperialist, colonialist system of governance is that countries simply trade to a mutual benefit between one another. So Saudi Arabia can use their own banks to develop those resources, or they can use Chinese or Russian banks or whoever, it doesn't matter. And then they can sell that oil to other countries. And the way it is today, the money, the proceeds for those sales are sitting at the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. So the Saudis have, last I looked, close to $800 billion worth of their money sitting with Federal Reserves, which then gives the United States the power to put a squeeze on the Saudis to say, like, hey, if we don't like it, we can. If we don't like your policies, we can freeze your assets. And then what are you going to do? But if countries trade freely between one another and do so on mutually acceptable, equitable terms, then everybody's better off. So, instead of one center of power extracting wealth from other colonies and all that wealth accruing to one hegemon, you have instead widely dispersed growth in prosperity everywhere. So, people's standards of living improve, people become wealthy and more affluent, as we should be, because our economies are spectacularly productive. We create tremendous wealth. And so this has been the Chinese model. The Chinese have lifted 850 million people out of poverty. And so now you have those people are affluent, money to spend. They can be active participants in the economy. They can make the economy bigger and more prosperous to everybody's benefit. And the Chinese are pursuing the same strategy worldwide. They want, they have positioned themselves strategically as the world's manufacturing hub, and they want the rest of the world to be their prosperous clients with money to spend. Well, there's no reason why everybody should be able to share those markets. So if you have several billion people with money to spend, then that's your market. That's who you can sell to if you have something to sell. You don't have to control the collateral and extract wealth to yourself, and then use that wealth to, make vaccines and biological weapons and build military bases and make sure everybody's in shackles. Why not just run the show so that everybody's doing well? And so I don't know, if I'm an entrepreneur and I make nice widgets that I want to sell to the world, which now I can because there's this thing called internet and e-commerce, and I can reach anybody in the world anywhere. And I don't know, if I can make 1 cent from 1 billion people, I had a good year, right? So everybody can participate in this. And I don't understand why people don't see that. Even Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is talking about how the United States has to maintain its hegemony in the Middle East, because if we get kicked out of all these energy resources, it's going to jeopardize our economy and blah, 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 blah. I would like to ask RFK Jr., Like, excuse me, how many military bases around the world does Switzerland have? Where do they have hegemony over energy resources that has made them one of the most prosperous and wealthy countries in the world with the number one highest living standard in the world? Where are their military bases? They don't have any. They just trade with the world. They run their strategy so they're like, hey, let's make things that we are good at making, and let's sell that to the world, and let's buy the things that we want, and everybody's happy, right? You don't need to have military bases and put guns to other people's heads to give you their oil and their lithium and their cobalt, and right? You can just trade for those. What do the Americans do? Well, Hollywood makes best movies in the world. I mean, it's toxic sludge, but I have to grant them, they're still the best in the world at telling a story. Like if you watch a Swedish or a French film, you want to shoot yourself in the face. Even if the story is good, by the time they told the story, you're like, God, what? did it have to be this painful? They have a good music scene. They make Gibson guitars. United States, I mean, okay. I know the United States consume, but then it has world's leading software industry, technology industry. It has all this phenomenal potential that it could offer to the markets in the world, and then they could buy good things to themselves. They don't have to spend all this money on military bases. And this would be the fact for everybody else, for the Russians, Croatians, Brazilians. And I think that this is the world we should aspire to, and this is the world that we should endeavor to build for, the benefit of our children and their children and the future generations. And wouldn't it be awesome if everybody was affluent and we could travel and visit with one another and trade and, do things like that, rather than, going to the front lines to kill the Russians so we can take their oil and regime change Kremlin. It's quite mental.
With apologies to the slow pace of the Swedish movie scene.
Yeah, or French, or like, I don't know.
So my next question, Marcelo, I can hear an echo of myself. I don't know what.
Yeah, I am trying to check here.
Okay.
All right, try now.
Okay, let me try again. So currently, the US dollar is a reserve currency. With this push for multipolarity, are we going to see a basket of currencies coming from BRICS? Is there going to be a single currency that'll eventually replace the USD? Where do you see that heading?
I think the United States dollar will gradually be losing its dominance as the global trade currency and as a global reserve currency. We already see the central banks around the world are trying to acquire gold on the fastest pace I think we've ever seen, or at least in the post-World War II time. I think that the trade in the future will be conducted in probably at first in terms of local currencies, the national currencies of countries that exchange. We had this. This is not terribly complicated. We had this system in the communist bloc. We had the thing called the clearing dollars, right? They were not real dollars, but they created a clearing system where the countries, Soviet bloc, and the countries, maybe non-aligned countries that traded with them, rather than exchanging U.S. dollars, with bank accounts in the New York banks or in London banks for euro dollars. They had these clearing accounts, and they somehow kept tab of who owed what to whom, and the system worked perfectly well. Obviously there's going to be problems if some country, imports a lot and doesn't export much, and then their currency is going to go down. But that's life. Nothing is guaranteed. You're going to have something on your balance sheet that's going to decline in value. You're going to have other things that are going to go up in value. That's a normal thing in life. As you know, like if you're a farmer, maybe one year you're going to have a bad crop, or one of your crops is going to fail, and that's just a fact of life. But it doesn't mean that we can't remove impediments to trade, and that we can't find others. Well, the IMF, for example, if you become a member of the IMF, you're actually agreeing to never trade to never export your commodities or whatever you're exporting in gold. So it's illegal for countries to say, okay, so we're sending you 1 million barrels of oil. Well, that'll be 10,000 ounces of gold. Thank you. That would not be enforceable. That would not be a legal contract, and you would come immediately under sanctions. But there's no reason why this all shouldn't be liberalized and then allow people to trade in whatever they want. Ounces of gold, Bitcoin, US dollars, yen, whatever, Brazilian real. And so I don't know, if I want to have Brazilian real in my bank account, then maybe tomorrow I'm going to buy something in Brazil that I would like to have, or maybe I'm going to exchange it for some Brazilian asset and then buy something from Argentina with that. Whatever, none of that is terribly complicated, and we do have the communications technology today that any of that can be arranged easily. It's the impediments and complications that are being forced into the equation by, the vested interest behind this empire that want us all to be their hostages and dependent on the systems that they have created. But as we speak, people like Sergei Glaziev and his team, and the Chinese and the Indians and the Iranians and everybody else are working out alternative solutions, and there's nothing that the empire can do to stop them. So again, the emergence and the growth of the BRICS is a very real thing. I think it's very powerful. It's like a tsunami rising. There's nothing they can do to stop it. And I think it's ultimately going to make us all much, much, much better off than we are today.
It's interesting that you mentioned gold, because literally Russia released some new information today. Uh-oh, I hear an echo of myself again. So they published their financial data from today, and their international gold and foreign exchange reserves reached their highest level since February 22, which is now at 614.5 billion as of August 23rd. Of course, half of these are frozen due to sanctions, so Russia didn't plan perfectly for the escalation in the war in Ukraine. But do you see using gold then as kind of a more sound way of essentially making your economy stable instead of printing money? I guess it's kind of an obvious question, but what do you think about these developments?
I used to think that, Nina, but I don't anymore. And the problem is that, if you use gold as your currency, or if you have a gold-backed currency, then yes, okay, you have sound money. But as the economy grows, there has to be more and more currency in the system in order to be able to lubricate that the exchange. And unless you find more gold and dig it up and tokenize it so that it can be used as means of exchange, then your economy starts to be held back, because even if you're raising the productivity in the system, there isn't enough means of exchange for the trade to go on. And so, also, second point with the gold, we used to have sound money. We used to have periods of history where they used silver coin or gold coin, and it wasn't a better world necessarily. The Roman Empire used silver denarius. It wasn't a good experience. Roman Empire was almost as bad as the British Empire and almost as bad as what we're seeing today. Or maybe it was worse. I don't know. But it was very, it was an oligarchy. It was a money lender controlled oligarchy, like the same as we have today, except it went on for several centuries, and it ended in dark ages. It ended in almost complete destruction of the civilization in Western Europe. And by the time the whole empire unraveled, we have several centuries then where stone houses disappeared from the archaeological record. Houses were no longer being built. Like the cheap goods that make things, like things that you need, like clay pots, bricks, nails, things like this that can be easily produced in very large quantities by a productive economy. It has the means of allocating credit and the means of exchange in relative abundance. Then all of these things get made, and so the economy is functional and it provides for people's needs. But if it disappears, as it did in Western Europe after 400, then practically the economy goes back to primitive exchange of bare necessities, barter. Anyway, so gold can play a role, but it can become also a choking point for economic growth. This is the same reason why I don't see the Bitcoin as a solution, because it's limited to 27 million Bitcoin, right? And no mas. And so what happens when you need more? I know. Bitcoin enthusiasts are going to bury me with arguments, but I'll tell you right in advance, you're wrong. Think it through. And, no, quite sincerely, think it through, because okay, let me try. I know we've been going on for a long time, but this is a relatively complex argument. But here is where our economies run into headwinds. Let's say that everything that's being produced in a certain economic system, like all the goods and services, they have a cost, and that cost is income to the people who produce it, and to the entrepreneurs, and to the to the banks that lend the money for all this. And at the same time, the aggregate cost and the aggregate income is the total purchasing power that's available in the system, right? And so for the economic system to be balanced, the aggregate prices of goods and services exactly absorb the purchasing power. Now, here's where the problem happens. That people normally retain part of their income as savings. And you can call that 5 to 10% typically. Sometimes it's more. But so in every business cycle, every year, typically, let's say 10% of the purchasing power is held back. So now all the goods and services that you produced, you cannot sell them at the aggregate prices. You're going to have to lower the prices, right? Or you're going to have to destroy the goods. And so what typically happens is that then the companies have to reduce prices, which means that they're not going to be very profitable. And then in the next cycle, they're going to maybe have to idle some of their capacities or sell it off, or let some people go. And what happens is that then you lower the purchasing power in the system still further, because now not everybody's making that income, right? You're producing less. So then in the next cycle, you're going to have to shrink still less, still farther the economy. So this creates a self-reinforcing deflationary cycle. It's look, what people call the the deflationary death cycle. And then if it up to itself with no government intervention, it would only stabilize at the depression level of activity. So, the necessities will be produced and exchanged, and that's that. The thing that's deflating economy is the means of exchange, the money, which is being withdrawn from circulation by two major means. One is savings. The other one is if because of the nature of the money we have today in circulation, every time you pay off your debts, that money disappears, right? So debt repayments and savings directly drain purchasing power from the system. And so, if you're going to avert a depression, the government has to step in, and then they have to become a participant, and not by taxing and spending, because taxation simply transfers purchasing power from people who earned it to the government. So there is no supplemental purchasing power that's being injected into the system. Instead, the governments have to take on debt. They have to borrow money in order to bridge this deflationary gap, so that the economy, all the goods and services can be sold and people make profits and everybody pays off the debts and the system doesn't shrink and collapse, right? So in effect, the government has to make sure that the quantity of money in circulation always grows to support economic growth. Now, the system that we have is rotten because the government has to borrow money from the private bankers, who are, the only ones who actually are making out like bandits. Everybody else, let's say that the playing field is a lot more level for the bankers than for anybody else. Nevertheless, the quantity of money in circulation has to keep up with the economic growth. Okay. Bitcoin, therefore, isn't a solution to this. And Bitcoin enthusiasts, they're enthusiasts mostly because they think they're going to make a lot of money by buying Bitcoin, not because they're actually using Bitcoin to buy their groceries and pay for their restaurant meals and so forth. Anyway, I think that today, we have understood the magic of money, because we have the information. The secret that the bankers were holding hidden from us for centuries is out. We can learn about it, we can understand how it works, and then we can upgrade the system, we can create a new, better operating system, but it will have to be geared to making our economies prosperous rather than making the bankers prosperous. But it can be done, it should be done, and I think it will be done. And this is one of the things I mentioned, Sergei Glaziev, this is one of the things he's devoted a very large chunk of his professional career to understanding these things and to designing. And I think that Russia today has a system that is a very promising foundation for exactly this type of a new monetary system, because the Russian government, I think, Treasury, the finance department, they can practically see the economic activity in Russia in real time, in a very granular way. And I think that then allows the government to always kind of keep the monetary stimulus, the credit impulse, to keep up with the economy. But, we'll see. We'll find out. I don't want to go on too long about
Yeah, obviously it's a very complex question, but thank you for, more echo. Marcelo, I keep hearing the echo of myself. It's very distracting.
Yes.
Thank you for debating Bitcoin enthusiasts who are not on the show, so they cannot respond. But that was very educational for those of us who do not dabble in Bitcoin. I guess my last question would be, and then Marcelo, you can jump in or we can look at the comments. There's lots of compliments in there. Do you view China as sort of the facilitator to the improvement of relations between Europe or the EU, maybe Europe without the EU, and Russia?
I think that the Chinese certainly will make their best good faith effort in this regard. They will, and they have done. They had Macron there, they had Scholz there, Orban. They speak with everybody, and they try to get them to be more cooperative, more constructive in their policies and so forth. I think that European leadership has gotten so hysterical, so unreasonable, so far from, I think that they have left themselves no face-saving ways to turn around and change their policies. I think they're stuck on the road to nowhere, and I think that it will take regime changes in all these countries to have a real change. So, maybe in Germany we'll have to see somebody like Sarah Wagenknecht or AfD take over. London's going to have to fall. In Paris, I don't know. It seems to me that right now there's a chance that the Front National, the Rassemblement National, is going to form the next government, which is, which actually ends up being what the French people had voted for, but it actually defies the second round of French elections in July this summer. So it's a mess, but nothing will improve with the current leadership in London, in Paris, in Berlin, and I think that same is true for Holland, for Ireland, for Sweden and Norway, Finland. Countries that are maybe a bit more open to reason are Italy and Slovakia and Hungary, but it'll be a process. So the Chinese might try, but I think that for as long as we have the current governments in power in all these European nations, and so for as long as the EU is still there to put a spanner in the works, it's going to be very difficult.
So Europe needs to free itself from the EU.
Free itself of the EU, absolutely. It's a fraudulent construction. It's not going to be a good episode in history. It's Shakespeare would say, shame and nothing but eternal shame.
Sorry for dropping out. This is why I'm paying $115 a month for the internet, is to disappear randomly. Marcelo, do you have any questions? I know it's been a lot of my questions, but I wanted to jump in and ask you.
I know at this time, I think my main interesting was, of course, about Brazil and BRICS and India-China situation. There's still, I would have some comments about the Ukraine Kursk incursion, but I think we can just leave it for other time. We are jumping into 2 hours already, and this has been a long Winter Latina show so far.
There's a lot of comments, but I'm not seeing quite comments phrased as questions. So I don't know if you noticed any actual questions. I'm seeing a lot of sort of commentary on what we've been talking about in the chat, but
there was one comment that I thought was interesting. At some point, I also stopped looking at comments because I was trying to fix everything that was broken. echo and breaking the sound and stuff like that. But uh, um, so this was a comment from Luis Hernan. I think he's from my channel actually. And it was the following. It's a bit big. It's going to be a quick read. I humbly suggest this reading: Europe versus America: Contradictions of Imperialism. English addiction. It mentions. The focus of this book is the emerging economy confrontation between European and US capitalism at the end of the golden age of capitalism in late 1960s. Ernest Mandel here paints a remarkably clear, comprehensive, and detailed portrait of trends. At that critical period, Mandel moves with ease from the most general international. I'm sorry, it's bad to read here. Oh, I lost.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
So is
Yeah,
it just
okay. So,
a book?
most general international problem to the specific of corporate activity and field developments into business and economic word scenes. Perhaps it's just too much information, and I read
It
it really
sounds like
bad.
it's a book recommendation as opposed to a question. So I guess my question then would be, to really wrap this up, is: are we going to go beyond capitalism? Is there going to be some sort of mixed system that maybe we're seeing in China, or are we going to stick to the system of capitalism that is then attached to liberalism in many cases?
Not to sound too fastidious, but I would hesitate to even answer that question without precisely defining the term. People say capitalism, usually in the West, I find that it refers to a label that's attached to a lot of ideological baggage. People think of it as, rugged individualism and, wealth creation and liberty and freedom. And it gets mixed up with all kinds of things. And then it's being contrasted with socialism. Then there's a lot of ideological baggage attached to that too. But capitalism is something you might find in China under communist rule, and then capital is there. It's a question of who owns it, who controls it. Is it privately owned? Is it publicly owned? Is it state owned? There's obviously going to have to be private enterprise that's going to be driving economic growth and prosperity, which means there has to be a vibrant small and medium-sized enterprise as the main growth engine of the economy. But then there's a very legitimate place for larger corporations, and then there's a very legitimate role for the state as at the very least as a regulator of the infrastructure assets and projects. And so I think it's very important to look at what works. We in the West have been very heavily brainwashed to simply take the blanket position that everything that's private, capitalist, blah, 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 is super awesome automagically, and no need to think farther than that. But then if you ask them like, okay, so how's your railway systems? What does your public transport look like? What's the state of your roads and airports in your country? The ports? And then ask them like who owns and manages the Japanese railway system, and who owns and operates the Swiss railway system. Those are jewels of economic enterprise. They're masterpieces, but they're state-owned and state-run. So, and then the postal system, one thing we had in Yugoslavia, which was absolutely phenomenal, was the postal system. Let's say that it worked like UPS or Federal Reserve on its best days, and it cost nothing. It cost next to nothing. And they dismantled it in favor of private enterprise and competitive services, and now it's a mess. It's a complete mess. It barely functions. So anyway, Nina, I don't quite know how to answer this, but I very much favor small and medium-sized enterprise, which means that you have to make credit readily and easily available to entrepreneurs, to families. You need to make it available on competitive terms and on long-term basis. Not like you have, okay, here's $1 million, but you have to pay back next year with 15% interest. In Germany, they had companies with 100-year loans, and it's part of the reason why Germany has been so spectacularly successful as a global exporter. So yeah, I prefer to avoid terms that immediately have ideological connotations that everybody gets excited about, and to simply take on the systems design approach. Let's design systems that work, and let's see what systems of incentives give us the results that we want, and which ones give us toxic results or opposite or unintended consequences, and then work around that. And there are many examples of things that have been done around the world that are remarkably successful, and they do the trick. They do what they're supposed to do, and they do it well and reliably. And so we should look into those models. Not everything has to be private enterprise capitalism, or else we should not have it, because that's communism and it's evil and blah blah blah. I just put myself through 2 minutes of my life listening to Millet lambasting socialism. He has no freaking idea what he's talking about. He has absolutely no idea. Either he doesn't know what he's talking about, or he's deliberately misleading the listeners, all under this ideological manipulation. It's like 2 minutes of ideological manipulation. Completely false. But if you talk to people about these issues, a lot of them will reflect exactly those same lines of thinking, those same arguments, and they won't question it any further.
Yeah, it's interesting. Whenever you mention certain issues without attaching a label, people will agree with you. But as soon as you call it socialism or capitalism or some kind of an ideology, maybe not an economic system, then there's an immediate reaction due to being raised in a particular total ideology of our society. So I think that's a really great point.
Exactly.
We've been using Alex's expertise now for 2 hours. We've survived being sort of thrown off the network. We're blaming a certain Bill. No, we're not blaming him. We're just kidding. I would like to remain alive. I would like to remain alive for the next little while. So, so we're not blaming anybody.
Yeah. So, yes, I think we can thank Mr. Alex and thank everybody that came to watch us. Remember, everybody, to like, share, subscribe. All the links for Alex social media, YouTube channel, LinkedIn, whatever you can find, his webpage, are on the descriptions. I also put the video that you mentioned before. I forgot the name. I put on my description. I'll send you the link later, Nina, so people that will watch later and know that the link for the video is in the description here. And yes, Nina, go ahead.
Thank you so much for putting up with us, Alex, for 2 hours. We would love to have you back. Maybe we can expand upon this ideological / economic discussion in a kind of more systemic way, because today we covered just about every topic, and we blamed London a lot, which I like to do as well. So we'd love to have you back at some point. But thank you guys for watching, and we will see you in the next one. Bye.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.